Banzai! Banzai! This word was used by Japanese soldiers in World War II, signaling the soldiers to attack the enemy. It was also used to honor the emperor. Welcome back, students, to our final video lecture for HIWD 541, World War II, Battles of the Pacific. I am your professor, Gene Freilich, and tonight we're going to be talking about the Battle of Okinawa. And I have a map here of the islands of Okinawa, and you can see all the islands, and there was also some memorials on the island for the soldiers who died in World War II. I just want to take a moment to congratulate you all on your diligence and perseverance in completing the assignments, and I wish you all continued success in your future studies. Today we want to cover the basic history and look at some of the reasons for the battle, why it was fought, and the outcomes for America and Japan. The battle was the last great battle of World War II. Even before its start, there were serious discussions as to whether to launch an offensive attack on Okinawa or on the island of Formosa. The Japanese knew that if American forces captured either island, they would be in a strategic position to launch bombers on the mainland. Battle of Okinawa started on April 1st, 1945, and ended on June 21st, 1945. Okinawa was inhabited by about 450,000 civilians who were quiet, easygoing people. When I was stationed at Kadena Air Base from 1980 to 1982, I can tell you that the people were very congenial and always polite and willing to help. They always bowed before speaking to me. The island is a very beautiful place to live, lush and tropical growth, lovely scenery. However, the typhoons are very dangerous and menacing. Fighting strategy employed by the Japanese soldiers during this battle differed from other battles they engaged in. In Okinawa, the Japanese let the Americans come on shore without engaging them on the beaches. Post-war accounts, however, criticize the Japanese army for using this strategy and feel the Americans should have been attacked on the beaches. This action surprised the American soldiers, and they all thought this island is going to be an easy capture. But in a week, they soon realized that they were mistaken. Okinawa had huge, massive, hidden structures that contain a network of tunnels and caves which were strategically placed and camouflaged and were heavily infused with military armaments. Toward the end of the campaign, the American soldiers had to resort to corkscrew and blowtorch tactics to destroy the Japanese soldiers. This battle lasted 3 months, and it was a long, arduous fight. So far in the Pacific, the Americans were able to push the Japanese back and were able to recapture the territories taken by the Japanese. Even so, the Japanese showed no sign of surrender. One thing that needs to be understood about the Japanese soldier is that they were taught from an early age never to surrender, and it was to their honor to die for the emperor. The Empire of Japan lasted for centuries, and by the time Emperor Hirohito took the throne, he was the 124th Emperor of Japan. People of Japan were always taught that to look upon the emperor would make you blind, and to touch the emperor, you would die. On this premise, you can see why the Japanese soldiers would fight to the death with each mission and make the enemy pay dearly with their blood. This is an important detail to remember, that as we examine this historical battle, we see how and why the Japanese fought so strenuously and never sounded retreat. To give an example of this, Lieutenant General Mitsusuro Ichijima and Lieutenant General Isamo Cho, who were commanders of the Japanese army on Okinawa, both committed ritual suicide as the Americans were advancing up the hill. They were not planning to be captured by the American forces or surrender. There was one operations officer, Hiromichi Yahara, who disguised himself as a civilian and was taken as a prisoner of war. Later, he was discovered because he didn't fit the profile of an Okinawan because he was much taller and more muscular. He later wrote his memoirs entitled The Battle for Okinawa. In this book, he stated that at the beginning of the battle, as they were watching the Americans come on shore, he stated, "He who wields power is unperturbed." After the war, his life, everything was taken from him. And he made a small living by working on a farm, being a salesman for a textile company, and opening a small store. He was disgraced by the Japanese because he did not commit suicide. Yahara believed that military action was useless unless the situation was properly analyzed, and he was right. This mindset also helps us to understand the contemporary issues and how these kinds of ideals shaped future wars. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz had the full support of President Roosevelt and the American people when launching this attack. Though everyone was war-weary, people were united in a quick resolution of the war with Japan. The war in Europe had already ended. Commanders of this operation had no knowledge of the development of the atomic bomb at this time. A serious controversy still exists today as to whether it was necessary to drop the 2 atomic bombs. Japan was already defeated and demoralized. But in the Japanese government, there continued to be a rivalry between the diehards who were committed to continuing the fight and the weak members of the Peace Party, who were afraid of the diehards. The Peace Party also knew defeat had come, but they were afraid to challenge the diehards, and Hirohito was also afraid. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Emperor Hirohito addressed the delegates that were assembled and read a poem about the disruption of peace in Japan. The delegation present bowed in respect when he spoke. Though their emotions were stirred, their minds were resolute on attacking Pearl Harbor. I believe that Hirohito could have saved his empire from the ravages of war if only he had ordered his generals to stand down. But by this time in his rule, he felt he had no control over the military. They had assumed control of the government. And they were of the mind that the Japanese people needed to expand their territory, as Hitler had done. Before Pearl Harbor, they had attacked territories in China. In 1937, when these attacks continued, the United States, Britain, and other countries who had vested interests in China froze their assets and cut off the oil supply. Still, Hirohito did not stop the war, but still spoke of peace and wanting to conduct concessions. The Army and Navy would not hear of it. As far as the atomic bomb was concerned, President Harry Truman believed it was completely necessary to drop the bombs on the mainland. He later said in a letter to his sister that was a terrible decision. In addition to Hirohito finally ordering his generals to surrender, the dropping of the bombs kept Stalin out of Western Europe and also made him question not attacking or conquering lands in Asia. American leaders felt the atomic bombs were necessary, and they ultimately saved more American soldiers' lives and quickly ended the war. Though the damage and lives lost they assumed would be catastrophic and unimaginable. When I was stationed at Kadena Air Base, I worked with an Okinawan who was a child when the bombs were dropped. And he remembered that they felt the tremors of the bomb on Okinawa. He also said that it was a traumatic event. Besides being the island being completely devastated, this event affected the people in a traumatic way. And as he told his story, he began to cry. Winston Churchill said, and I quote, The strength and willpower, devotion, and technical resources applied by the United States to this task, joined with the death struggle of the enemy, placed this battle among the most intense and famous in military history." Unquote. The outcomes of the battle were shrouded by the death of President Roosevelt, the surrender of German forces, the suicide of Hitler, and the atomic bombs that were dropped. Though the Japanese were responsible for bringing the Americans into the war, during the negotiations for surrender, they asked if they could be allowed to keep Emperor Hirohito as the sovereign ruler of Japan, and the Allies agreed. When Hirohito accepted the conditions of surrender, he addressed his nation on the radio, explaining that it was necessary to surrender to avoid continued assaults from America, and that this surrender would save the lives of not only the Japanese, but the entire human race. This was the first time the Japanese people heard the emperor speak. Many of the battles of World War II were devastating, and many sacrificed their lives. It is estimated that between 55 and 70 million people died during World War II. The Battle of Okinawa was no exception, being classified as the bloodiest battle on Japanese territory. Some further readings for you include George Pfeiffer's Tenno-zan, The Battle for Okinawa and the Atomic Bomb, William Manchester's Goodbye, Darkness, a memoir of the Pacific War, and Eugene B. Sledge's With the Old Breed.